Have you ever read a story from the Bible and wondered what was happening just off the page? What were ordinary people doing while history was being made? What did they eat? How did they work? And how did their faith guide them, not just in the temple, but through a sudden storm, a failed harvest, or a simple family meal? In this story, we're going to answer those questions. We're stepping away from the kings and the prophets to spend time with a humble family in Nazareth. This is a journey into the heart of their world, filled with the authentic details of their challenges and their joys. If you've ever wanted to truly feel what it was like to live in biblical times, this is the story for you. Chapter 1, The First Light. The first pale fingers of dawn crept through the single high window of the mud brick home, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. Within that simple dwelling in Nazareth, the day began not with a clamor, but with a series of gentle, practiced movements, a silent symphony of faith and provision. Joseph was the first to stir, his body attuned to the subtle shift from dark to light. He rose from his mat, the rough woolen blanket fallen away, and his first conscious act was a quiet glance round the single room that sheltered his family. His eyes, still heavy with sleep, scanned the familiar shapes in the dimness. His wife, Miriam, her form a gentle mound nearby, and the smaller shapes of their children, Leah and Samuel, nestled together for warmth. His bare feet met the packed earth floor, cool and solid. He moved first to the corner where their donkey stood, its patient form a dark silhouette, a soft touch to its flank, a check of the hay, a quiet reassurance. Nearby the family's two goats shifted, their soft bleats a question in the morning hush. Joseph ran a hand over Anani's coarse hair, his touch a wordless promise of care, a silent acknowledgment of their shared existence under this roof. These creatures were not merely possessions. They were part of the household's fragile economy, their milk and labor a direct answer to daily prayers for sustenance. As Joseph tended to the animals, Miriam awoke. Her movements were fluid and efficient, born of 1,000 such mornings. She went to the small stone-lined hearth in the center of the room, the heart of their home. Kneeling, she gathered last night's embers, coaxing them back to life with dried twigs and a steady, gentle breath. A tiny flame flickered, caught, and grew, its orange light pushing back the shadows and painting her serene face in warm tones. She added a few small logs, and soon the fire crackled with purpose, ready to receive the pot of water and barley that would become their morning porridge. The growing light and the scent of kindling wood roused the children. Leah, the elder, stretched like a young cat before rising to join her mother. Samuel, younger and still wrapped in the soft cocoon of dreams, rubbed his eyes with small fists. Miriam handed Leah the clay water jar, a task she had performed countless times. The girl lifted it with both hands, her small shoulders squaring with the responsibility. Samuel, now fully awake, scrambled to his feet and took the smaller jug, his expression one of grave importance. Together they slipped out the low doorway into the cool, lavender-tinted morning, their mission to fetch water from the village, well, a sacred part of the day's commencement. Outside, the world was washed in the soft, hopeful light of a new day. The air was clean and carried the scent of damp earth and waking herbs. From other homes, similar threads of smoke began to rise, weaving a tapestry of morning above Nazareth. Inside, the porridge began to simmer, releasing a humble, earthy aroma that promised warmth and filling. Joseph returned from his ministrations, his large calloused hand resting briefly on Miriam's shoulder as she stirred the pot. It was a touch that spoke volumes of partnership and shared burden, a silent communion in the simple act of beginning again. There were no grand pronouncements, no elaborate rituals, only the profound faith that this day, like all the others, would be met with enough. The light strengthened, filling the room and illuminating the dust now settled, the simple tools, the faces of a family, trusting in the grace of a new dawn. Chapter 2. Joseph's net. The coarse fibers bit into Joseph's calloused fingers as he worked, his hands moving with a rhythm born of decades. Seated on a sun-bleached rock by the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he methodically repaired the torn net spread across his lap. The morning sun, now fully risen, glittered on the gentle waves, turning the surface into a vast, shifting tapestry of silver and blue. Each pull of the cord, each careful knot, was a meditation. The repetitive motion carried his mind back to another shoreline, to a time when his own father's larger, rougher hands had guided his smaller ones through these same tasks. He could almost hear the low, patient voice explaining that a net was like faith. Its strength lay not in a single strand, but in the integrity of every connection, every carefully mended break. A single weak point could unravel hours of work and empty the promised bounty back into the deep. With the final knot secured, Joseph stood, his joints protesting mildly. He coiled the heavy net with practiced ease, the weight of it a familiar comfort over his shoulder. Other fishermen were already at the water's edge, their boats bobbing like resting gulls on the placid surface. He waded into the cool water, the shock of it a sharp, waking clarity, and pushed his small wooden boat from the shallows, climbing aboard with a balance that was second nature. The oars settled into the oarlocks with a solid thunk, and soon he was pulling away from the shore, the rhythmic dip and pull of the oars cutting cleanly through the water. The other boats fanned out around him, a small fleet of hope against the vastness of the lake. But the sea was a fickle companion. The gentle lapping against the hull soon grew into a more insistent slap, as a wind swept down from the surrounding hills, ruffling the water's surface into a chaos of choppy waves. The boat began to pitch and roll, no longer gliding, but fighting for every foot of progress. Salt spray stung Joseph's face, and his muscles burned with the effort of keeping the bow pointed into the swells. His jaw tightened, not with fear, but with a fierce, quiet determination. Each straining pull of the oars was a silent plea, a prayer woven into physical exertion. He was not asking for riches, only for enough fish to trade for grain, to mend a leaking roof, to see the light of security in Miriam's eyes at the end of the day. His entire being, from his aching shoulders to his steadfast heart, was focused on this single purpose: to provide. He finally reached the spot where the water turned a deeper, darker blue. With a final grunting heave, he shipped the oars and stood, the boat rocking precariously beneath his feet. He hefted the heavy net, gathering it in his arms. For a moment, he was a statue against the sky, a silhouette of resolve poised between the turbulent heavens and the mysterious deep. Then, with a powerful, sweeping motion born of long practice, he cast the net. It flew out in a perfect widening circle, the lead weights pulling the edges down into the dark water, a woven prayer sinking beneath the waves. He watched the last bubbles rise and vanish. His breath held, his entire world narrowed to the single, taut rope in his hand, waiting for a sign, for a tremor, for the gentle tug that meant his faith and his labor had been answered. Chapter 3. Miriam's hearth. The rhythm of the grinding stone was the heartbeat of the morning, a steady, grating music that spoke of transformation. Miriam knelt on the packed earth floor, her body swaying slightly with the motion of the heavy, hand-shaped quern. Back and forth, her strong arms pushed the upper stone over the lower, crushing the golden kernels of wheat she had carefully winnowed the day before. A fine, pale dust rose with each pass, coating her hands and forearms in a ghostly film, the very scent of the flour, earthy, sweet, and promising, filling the small home. This was alchemy of the most fundamental kind, turning the hard-won gift of the field into the soft powder that would become the bread of life for her family. Each handful of grain was a small miracle, and her work was a prayer of gratitude, a slow, deliberate act of creation. Once a sufficient mound of fine flour had gathered in the woven basket at her side, she brushed her hands clean against her simple tunic and turned her attention to the fire. The morning's embers still glowed warmly in the hearth. She added a few more sticks, and as the flames licked eagerly at the new fuel, she mixed the flour with water and a pinch of precious salt, kneading the dough in a wide, shallow clay bowl. Her hands worked the mixture with a knowing pressure, folding and pressing until the texture was smooth and elastic. She divided the dough into several small rounds, patting and stretching each one into a thin, perfect circle before laying them carefully on the flat, heated stone at the fire's edge. A soft hiss greeted each one, and soon the rich, comforting aroma of baking bread joined the scent of wood smoke. With the bread begun, her work flowed seamlessly to the small plot of land behind their home. The sun was warmer now, beating down on the neat rows of vegetables she tended with the same devotion she gave her children. Here, the deep green spikes of onions stood in soldier-straight lines. Nearby, the broad leaves of squash plants sprawled, their yellow flowers like tiny suns. She moved among them, her fingers deft and gentle, checking the soil for moisture, plucking the occasional weed that dared to encroach, her touch a blessing on the burgeoning life. This small garden was her personal covenant with the earth, a testament to her care, ensuring that even when the sea yielded nothing, their table would not be bare. Later, as the morning stretched toward noon, she sat in the shade of the dwelling's outer wall with her daughter Leah. Between them lay a pile of supple reeds, soaking in a basin of water to keep them pliable. Miriam's hands moved with an artist's grace, selecting, bending, and weaving the strands into the beginnings of a new basket. Leah watched, her small face a mask of intense concentration, her own fingers clumsy and uncertain as she tried to mimic her mother's movements. Miriam did not rush her, her own steady work a silent lesson in patience. She would gently correct a misplaced reed, her touch a guide, her presence a calm anchor in the child's frustration. The creation of the basket was not about speed, but about care, about building something strong and useful from seemingly insignificant parts. The lesson, however, was soon punctuated by a sharp, shattering crack. Leah, reaching for another reed, had knocked a small clay pot from a low ledge. It hit the hard ground and fractured into several coarse terracotta pieces, spilling a few precious dried lentils into the dust. The girl froze, her eyes wide with horror at the accident, her lower lip beginning to tremble. Miriam did not scold. She simply set her own weaving aside and knelt, gathering the broken pieces into her palm. She looked at them, then at her daughter's stricken face. She picked up two of the larger fragments and held them together, showing Leah how they once fit, how the pot had been whole. Then, with a calm that seemed to still the very air, she began to sweep the shards into a small pile. Her actions were not of anger, but of quiet resolution, a demonstration that things break, and that the true test of strength was not in avoiding the break, but in gathering the pieces and moving forward without despair. The broken pot was not a catastrophe. It was simply the next thing to be dealt with, a small, tangible lesson in the resilience required by every life lived close to the earth. Chapter 4. Breaking bread, the sun reached its zenith, pouring a blanket of brilliant, unwavering light over Nazareth, and inside the mud-brick home, the morning's industry gave way to the quiet ritual of the noon meal. The air, once filled with the scent of grinding grain and baking bread, now held the richer, savory aromas of their simple feast. Miriam laid a coarse woven cloth upon the floor, and upon it she placed the still warm flatbreads, their surfaces blistered and golden from the hearthstone. Beside them sat a small clay bowl of olives, their dark skins gleaming with a film of precious oil, and another dish holding pieces of dried fish, a portion of Joseph's recent catch from the sea. It was a humble spread, each item a testament to their labor. The bread from Miriam's grinding and baking, the fish from Joseph's nets, the olives from the gnarled trees on the hillside. There were no grand dishes, no elaborate spices, only the honest, direct fruits of their land and water. And in its simplicity, the meal felt profound. The family gathered around the cloth, their shadows small and dark beneath them. Joseph bowed his head first, his work-roughened hands resting on his knees. Miriam and the children followed, their postures softening into a moment of silent gratitude. There were no spoken words, but the stillness was thick with acknowledgment, a thanks for the sun that had ripened the grain, for the sea that had yielded its bounty, for the hands that had worked to bring it to this table. It was a nourishment that went beyond the physical, a quiet feast for the spirit that recognized the divine thread woven through every crumb of bread and every salty olive. When they looked up, their eyes met in a shared understanding, a bond strengthened by this daily act of thankfulness. As they ate, tearing pieces of bread to scoop up the rich flesh of the olives and fish, a different kind of hunger surfaced in young Samuel. His brow was furrowed, his gaze distant as he chewed slowly. He had been listening intently to the readings in the synagogue, the ancient rolling words of the Torah that spoke of covenants and commandments, of a God whose voice thundered from mountains and whispered in the hearts of prophets. The words were vast and mysterious, and they had taken root in his young mind. He looked from his father to his mother, his expression one of earnest confusion, his curiosity a small, bright flame amidst the simple meal. He wondered aloud, not with challenging words, but with a tone of genuine seeking, how the words on the scrolls, stories of parting seas and manna from heaven, connected to the dusty reality of their daily lives in Nazareth, to the mending of nets and the grinding of flour. Joseph finished a mouthful of bread, his gaze softening as he regarded his son. He saw not impertinence, but the first stirrings of a deep and questioning faith. He recounted a story then, his voice a low, steady rumble that filled the quiet room. He spoke of an elder from his own youth, a man whose back was as bent as an olive tree, but whose eyes held the light of profound wisdom. This elder had once said that the Torah was not a distant star, but the very ground beneath their feet. He had taught that every loaf of bread baked with patience was a verse, every net mended with care a prayer, every act of provision for one's family a fulfillment of the law. The law, the elder insisted, was not just in the scroll, but in the sharing of a meal, in the kindness offered to a neighbor, in the gratitude felt for a simple bowl of olives under the noon sun. It was faith made tangible, God's will made manifest in the sweat of the brow and the breaking of bread. A deep peace settled over the family as Joseph's words faded. Samuel's frown had smoothed, replaced by a look of quiet comprehension. He looked down at the piece of bread in his hand, no longer seeing just food, but a part of the great ongoing story of his people. The simple meal was transformed, each bite a communion, each flavor a reminder of a covenant that stretched from the ancient past to this very moment, binding them to their God, their land, and to each other in a sacred cycle of gratitude and grace. The nourishment was complete, filling both body and soul as the sun continued its slow journey across the sky. Chapter 5. Village Rhythms. The heartbeat of Nazareth was not a single drum, but a symphony of interwoven lives, a tapestry of sound and motion that pulsed from the first light of dawn to the softening of the evening. After the quiet intimacy of their noon meal, the family stepped out into the full-throated life of the village, becoming threads once more in the vibrant communal fabric. The dusty central square, baked pale gold by the relentless sun, was the stage for this daily performance. Near the stone-lined well, the village's enduring heart, a cluster of women gathered, their clay jars resting on hips or balanced on heads. As they waited their turn, their laughter and the low murmur of their conversation wove through the air, a steady, melodic counterpoint to the creak of the rope and the splash of water drawn from the cool, deep darkness below. This was more than a chore. It was a daily council, a sharing of news, worries, and small joys, their solidarity as essential as the water they collected. Children wove through the scene like darting sparrows, their bare feet kicking up little puffs of dust. Their games were simple and timeless, chasing one another around the trunks of ancient olive trees, tossing smooth stones into traced squares on the ground, their shrieks of delight ringing out, pure and unburdened. They were the village's unchecked joy, their energy a testament to a community that, while often hard-pressed, nurtured its future. From the other side of the square came a different, more percussive music, the rhythmic, metallic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Inside the dark, open-fronted workshop, sparks flew in brilliant, short-lived arcs as the smith, his face glistening with sweat and his powerful arms corded with muscle, shaped a glowing piece of iron on his anvil. Each strike was purposeful, transforming raw, stubborn metal into a useful tool, a new plowshare for a farmer, a hinge for a door, a nail to secure a roof beam. His work was the village's strength, its resilience forged in fire and sweat. It was into this harmonious bustle that old Aaron's trouble wove itself. His dwelling, on the edge of the square, had a section of its low outer wall that had succumbed to the recent rains, the stones tumbling into a careless heap, leaving a gaping wound in the boundary of his home. The old man stood before it, his shoulders slumped in a posture of weary defeat, one gnarled hand resting on a remaining stable stone as if seeking its strength. He did not stand alone for long. Joseph, seeing his neighbor's plight, simply nodded to Miriam and moved toward the fallen stones. There was no discussion, no request for payment or favor. It was an unspoken law, as binding as any carved in stone. A family's weakness was the community's responsibility. Soon, the entire family was immersed in the task. Joseph and Samuel began lifting the heavier mud-caked stones, their muscles straining as they set them aside to be cleaned and reused. Miriam and Leah joined the other village women who had appeared as if by instinct, carrying baskets of clay and buckets of water to mix the thick, binding mortar. The work was hard and messy. The sun beat down on the backs, and the dust from the dry earth and the wet clay coated their skin and simple tunics. Yet a spirit of cheerful industry settled over them. The children's games shifted, now fetching smaller stones for the fill or carrying cups of water to the workers. The rhythmic scraping of trowels and the soft thud of stones being set into place became a new part of the village's music. As the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the square, the wall began to rise again. Stone by stone, layer by layer, the gap was filled, the new section standing slightly different in color and texture, but every bit as strong as the old. It was a patchwork, but it was solid. When the last stone was set and the final smear of mortar applied, Aaron placed a trembling hand on Joseph's arm, his eyes glistening with an emotion too deep for words. The simple act of rebuilding a wall had done more than restore a physical boundary. It had reinforced the invisible ones that truly held the village together. It was a testament to a truth they all lived by, that no one in Nazareth truly built, or repaired, or prospered alone. As the evening cooled, the dust, and the families began to drift back to their own hearths, the restored wall stood as a silent, sturdy monument not to one man's labor, but to the collective, unyielding strength of a community bound by shared burdens and a common faith. Chapter 6. Clouds on the horizon, a subtle shift in the light, was the first warning. A slow leaching of the brilliant afternoon gold into a muted, ominous brass. The wind, which had been a gentle companion all day, stilled completely, leaving the air thick and heavy, pressing down on Nazareth with a palpable weight. The change was felt before it was fully seen, a tension that crept into the village square, silencing the playful shrieks of the children and hushing the easy chatter by the well. Then, from the west, over the distant hills, they appeared. They were not the soft white puffs that often decorated the sky, but a solid, slate-gray mass rolling forward with a slow, inexorable purpose, their underbellies bruised with shades of purple and black. They were the color of a fresh bruise, and they brought with them a deep, unnatural silence that felt louder than any storm. Joseph, who had been mending a harness near the doorway of his home, straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. The sight of those clouds triggered an old, deep-seated knowledge in his bones, a fisherman's instinct for reading the moods of water and sky. This was not a passing squall. He dropped the leather strap and moved with a new, urgent purpose. His path took him down the familiar winding track to the Sea of Galilee. The water, usually a vibrant blue, now looked like dull, hammered lead, its surface ominously still, as if holding its breath. The other fishermen were already there, their movements sharp and efficient. Together, without need for discussion, they became a single organism of preparation. They dragged the smaller, lighter boats far up the stony beach, beyond the reach of any surging waves. The larger vessels were secured with extra ropes, the knots checked and double-checked, the anchors dug deep into the shingle. Joseph's large, capable hands worked alongside the others, pulling the coarse ropes taut, his mind already calculating the force of the wind hinted at by those towering clouds. Each secured boat was a small victory against the coming chaos, a fragile claim of order in the face of the gathering tempest. Back at the house, Miriam had felt the change in the air as keenly as her husband. Her movements, always calm, took on a focused intensity. She went to the large sealed storage jars where she kept the family's precious reserves of wheat and barley. Lifting the heavy stone lids, she checked the levels, her fingers brushing against the dry, golden grains. She then began the methodical work of transferring more from the smaller daily-use containers, ensuring the main stores were full and the lids were sealed tight against any driven rain or seeping dampness. This was not hoarding. It was the wisdom of generations, the understanding that a storm could isolate a village, that a flooded path could become an uncrossable chasm. The grain was their lifeline, and securing it was an act of love, a quiet defiance against the threat of hunger. She moved then to the clay pots of oil and the baskets of dried figs and lentils, shifting them to the driest, most protected corner of the home, building a small fortress of provisions against the uncertainty that loomed outside. Leah and Samuel, sensing the sharpening anxiety in their parents' usually steady demeanors, were given their own vital tasks. Their mother pointed to the small, scraggly flock of chickens that pecked and scratched in the dust outside their door. The birds, too, seemed to sense the impending disruption, clucking nervously and ruffling their feathers. The children, their small faces set with grave importance, began to herd them toward the small stone-walled enclosure built against the side of the house. It was a chaotic, flapping process, but they worked together, Samuel shooing the birds from behind while Leah guided them toward the narrow opening. Once the last speckled hen was safely inside, Samuel slid the wooden bar across the entrance, locking them in their cramped but secure shelter. The simple act felt immensely significant, a part of the family's collective battening down of hatches. By the time the tasks were complete, the sky had darkened to the color of charcoal. The first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills, a long, low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. It was a sound that confirmed the whispered rumors that had been passed from house to house all afternoon. Talk of a storm the likes of which had not been seen in years, stories of flash floods in the wadis and roofs torn from their beams. A palpable anxiety now clung to the village, thick as the humid air. Neighbors exchanged worried glances instead of greetings. Doors were closed and barred. The vibrant rhythms of the day had been utterly silenced, replaced by waiting, watchful stillness. The family stood for a moment just inside their doorway, looking out at the bruised and angry sky. The world felt poised on a knife's edge, the familiar comforts of home and hearth suddenly feeling fragile as the dark clouds on the horizon promised to unleash their fury upon them all. Chapter 7. The storm's fury. The first drops fell like stones, heavy and sparse, cratering the dry, packed earth with dark, angry splashes. Then the sky tore open. A torrential curtain of water descended upon Nazareth, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sound. The wind arrived not as a gust, but as a wall, slamming into the village with a force that made the very mud-brick walls tremble. It howled through the narrow streets, a demonic voice ripping at loose shutters and tearing leaves from the stoic olive trees. Inside their home, the family huddled together, the world outside reduced to a chaos of lashing rain and shrieking wind. The single small window became a cataract of running water, obscuring the view of a village being punished by the heavens. The fire in the hearth, so carefully tended all day, guttered and spat as damp air and driven rain found their way down the smoke hole, filling the room with the acrid scent of wet ash and fear. Samuel pressed his small body against his mother's side, his face buried in the rough fabric of her tunic. Each crack of thunder was a physical blow, causing him to flinch, his small shoulders tensing with a terror he could not name. The world he knew, the safe, sun-drenched world of play and chores, had been ripped away and replaced with this primal fury. He could feel the vibration of the storm through the floor, a constant, threatening growl that promised the walls might not hold. His breath came in quick, shallow hitches, his wide eyes fixed on the shuddering door as if expecting some monstrous force to break through it. Miriam felt the tremors running through her son's frame. She wrapped an arm around him, pulling him closer, her own heart a steady, calming drum against his ear. She began to speak, her voice a soft, unwavering melody rising to meet the storm's cacophony. She did not tell him there was nothing to fear. Instead, she wove a tapestry of memory, recounting the great storm of her own girlhood, a tempest that had seemed, to her child's mind, like the end of all things. She spoke of the same howling wind, the same terrifying thunder, and of how her own father had gathered their family just like this, in the heart of their home. She described the morning after, when the sun had returned brilliant and clean, and the village had emerged, shaken but unbroken, to find a world washed new. Her story was not a dismissal of his fear, but an absorption of it, a reminder that they had endured this before, that the fury always passed. Joseph, seeing the power of her words, added his own thread to the narrative. His voice, deeper and rougher than Miriam's, spoke of the sea's rage, of waves that rose like mountains and tried to swallow his boat whole. He spoke of the fear that was a fisherman's constant companion and of the faith that was his only anchor. He described the feeling of utter smallness on the vast, angry water and the profound, soul-deep peace that came from whispering a prayer into the teeth of a gale and trusting in a power greater than the storm. His was a story of survival, not through strength, but through surrender to a divine will that held even the wind and the waves in its hand. Then Miriam began to sing. It was not a loud song to compete with the storm, but a quiet, ancient psalm, its familiar rolling cadences a balm to the ragged edges of their nerves. Her voice was a low, steady hum at first, then grew in gentle strength. One by one, the others joined her. Joseph's bass rumble provided a foundation, Leah's clear young voice a higher harmony, and finally, Samuel's small, shaky treble wove itself into the family's chorus. They sang of the Lord being their shepherd, of walking through the valley of the shadow, of fearing no evil. The words, worn smooth by generations of use, filled the cramped, dark space with a light that the storm could not extinguish. They sang of green pastures and still waters, a stark, beautiful contrast to the raging chaos outside their walls. As the psalms wove their spell, Samuel's trembling began to subside. The tight knot of fear in his chest loosened, not because the storm had lessened, it raged on with undiminished violence, but because he was no longer facing it alone. He was encased in a fortress of shared faith and familial love, a bulwark stronger than any mud brick wall. He lifted his head from his mother's shoulder, his tears drying on his cheeks. He looked at the faces of his family, illuminated in the sporadic flashes of lightning, his father's resolute jaw, his sister's closed eyes in concentration, his mother's serene profile. He saw not fear, but a profound and unshakable peace. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and when the next peal of thunder shook the house, he did not flinch. He simply opened his mouth and let his small voice rise again with the others, a tiny but defiant flicker of light in the overwhelming dark, his own fledgling faith soothed and strengthened by the unwavering certainty in his mother's song. Chapter 8. Aftermath and aid. The storm had exhausted itself by dawn, leaving behind a world washed raw and strangely silent. The first light revealed Nazareth not as the familiar sun-baked village of dusty paths and sturdy dwellings, but as a landscape of wreckage and water. Joseph was the first to push open the heavy door, which groaned in protest, its lower edge scraping through a thick slurry of mud and debris. The air that greeted him was cool and heavy, with the smell of wet earth, crushed herbs, and something else, the sharp, clean scent of devastation. Where the central square had been, a shallow, murky lake now shimmered, reflecting the bruised pinkish gray of the morning sky. The well was a solitary island in this new, unwanted sea. All around, the evidence of the storm's passage was stark and sobering. Roofs, usually crowned with neat thatching, were torn open, their skeletal rafters exposed to the sky like broken ribs. Branches, some as thick as a man's arm, lay scattered everywhere, tangled with torn fishing nets, shreds of clothing, and the sad, sodden remains of a child's discarded toy. But even amidst the ruin, the true rhythm of the village was already reasserting itself. As the sun climbed, burning away the last of the low-hanging mist, the people of Nazareth emerged from their homes. There were no cries of despair, only a quiet, collective intake of breath before the work began. Men and women, their faces etched with fatigue but set with determination, waded into the flooded paths, their feet sinking into the cold muck. They worked with a wordless, shared purpose, forming human chains to pass heavy waterlogged branches out of the way, using shovels and bare hands to clear drainage channels clogged with silt and stone. The sounds of the village were no longer laughter and chatter, but the steady splash of water, the grating scrape of wood on stone, and the low, grunting efforts of people reclaiming their home from the chaos. Joseph joined the effort without hesitation, his fisherman's strength a welcome asset, as he helped two other men lift a fallen section of a neighbor's fence. His eyes, however, kept drifting toward the small, isolated dwelling of an elderly couple, Eleazar and Ruth, which stood slightly apart on a small rise. Their home had fared worse than most. A large section of its roof had been peeled away, the thatch scattered down the hillside like straw after a threshing. The old man was standing outside, staring up at the gaping hole with a look of profound helplessness, while his wife sat on a rain-soaked stool, her head in her hands, her thin shoulders shaking. Their children were grown and gone to other towns, and in their advanced years they possessed the will but not the strength to repair such damage. Seeing their plight, a deep, instinctive compassion stirred in Joseph's chest. He finished helping with the fence, then, with a quiet word to Miriam, he gathered his tools, a coil of sturdy rope, a wooden mallet, and an axe. He sloshed through the flooded path and up the rise toward the elderly couple's home. Eleazar looked up as he approached, his clouded eyes blinking in surprise and dawning hope. Joseph did not offer grand speeches or empty condolences. He simply laid a hand on the old man's bony shoulder, a gesture of solid, unspoken support, and then set to work. He assessed the damage with a practiced eye, then began gathering the scattered, sodden thatch, salvaging what he could. He sent Samuel, who had followed him, to find undamaged reeds from the marshier ground near the stream. For the next several hours, Joseph worked under the climbing sun. He cut new wooden supports, his mallet blows ringing out in a steady, reassuring rhythm. He climbed onto the damaged roof, his movements sure and careful, and began the intricate work of weaving the new reeds with the old, creating a tight, waterproof seal. Below, Miriam and Leah arrived, not empty-handed. They carried a pot of warm lentil stew and a loaf of the bread Miriam had baked just before the storm. They sat with Ruth, their quiet presence in the offering of warm food a comfort more tangible than any words. Leah gently took the old woman's hand, and the simple human contact seemed to thaw some of the frozen shock in Ruth's eyes. By the time the sun was high overhead, the hole in the roof was patched, a neat, dark scar against the older, weathered thatch. It was not perfect, but it was strong, and it would keep out the rain. Eleazar, his voice thick with emotion, tried to offer Joseph a small carved wooden bowl, one of his few treasures. Joseph gently refused, closing the old man's fingers back around it. The reward was not in payment, but in the light that had returned to the couple's eyes, in the way Ruth's hand now rested steady on her husband's arm. As Joseph and his family made their way back down the hill, they saw similar scenes playing out across the village. A shared loaf of bread here, a neighbor helping to bail out a flooded home there, the strong lifting burdens for the weak. The storm had been an act of indiscriminate violence, but the aftermath was becoming an act of deliberate, profound compassion. The village was not just clearing debris, it was reaffirming the invisible bonds that truly held it together, each act of aid a stone laid back into the foundation of their shared humanity, a testament to a faith made visible not in words, but in muddy, blistered hands and shared bread. Chapter 9. The Wanderer's Words. The evening air, still damp from the storm's passing, carried the scent of wet earth and bruised mint. The family sat outside their dwelling on rough-hewn stools, enjoying the cool tranquility that had followed the day's labor of repair. The village was quiet, its usual evening rhythms subdued by exhaustion and the shared memory of the night's terror. Into this hushed atmosphere, a stranger appeared at the edge of the square. He was a man of the road, his sandals coated in the dust of many miles, his cloak frayed at the edges, and his skin tanned to the texture of old leather by a relentless sun. He moved with the weary but purposeful gait of one who carries news, his eyes holding a light that seemed to burn with stories from distant places. He approached the small cluster of villagers, his arrival noted by silent, curious glances. Yosef offered a man a cup of water, which he accepted with a grateful nod, drinking deeply. As the last of the daylight bled from the sky, staining the scattered clouds in shades of rose and violet, the wanderer began to speak. His voice was a low, gravelly instrument, but it carried a current of undeniable wonder. He spoke of a town by the sea called Capernaum, a place bustling with fishermen and traders. But it was not the commerce he wished to describe. It was the man named Jesus. He told of crowds that pressed in so thickly the very air seemed to vibrate with their need. He spoke of the sick being carried on mats by desperate loved ones, their bodies racked with fevers or twisted by ailments that had stolen their strength for years. He described a scene of profound human suffering laid bare under the Galilean sun. Then, his tone shifting to one of reverent awe, the traveler recounted what happened next. He told of this Jesus moving through the throng, not as a physician with herbs and poultices, but as a conduit of something far greater. He spoke of a mere touch, a word spoken with quiet authority, and the fever would break like a spell, the heat leaving the body as suddenly as a shadow flees from light. He described a man whose hand, withered and useless for decades, was stretched out at Jesus' command. The wanderer held up his own hand, fingers splayed, mimicking the miracle as he described the tendons strengthening, the flesh filling out, the fingers flexing with a life they had not known since youth. He told of a woman, bent double for 18 years, who felt his hands upon her and slowly, miraculously, straightened to her full height, her face turned to the sky for the first time in a generation, her tears of shock and joy mingling with the dust. The family listened, utterly captivated. Miriam's hands, which had been idly carding wool, still completely in her lap. Yosef leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his usual pragmatic expression replaced by one of deep, wondering thoughtfulness. Samuel's eyes were wide, his young mind struggling to picture such impossible scenes. But it was Leah who was most visibly transfixed. The stories of healing sank into her heart like seeds into fertile soil. She saw not just the miracles, but the profound restoration, the return of hope, where there had been only despair, the mending of lives that had been broken. The wanderer's tales painted a picture of a world where the divine was not a distant, abstract force, but an active, compassionate presence that could reach into the deepest suffering and rewrite its story. As the traveler finished his account, a profound silence fell over the little group, broken only by the first chirping of crickets in the cooling air. The stories hung in the twilight, luminous and challenging. Leah, her voice small but clear in the quiet, turned her gaze from the wanderer to her father. The hope kindled in her by the tales now burned with a personal, urgent question. If such power could flow in Capernaum, if the blind could see and the lame could walk by the sea, then could it not also touch their own humble village? Could the divine possibility that had visited that bustling town not also find its way to the dusty, unassuming paths of Nazareth? Her question was not one of doubt, but of yearning. a child's pure and powerful hope that the miracles lighting up the horizon were not for others alone, but might also one day grace the place she called home. Chapter 10. Seeds of Faith. The purple dusk settled over Nazareth like a soft shroud, the last embers of the sunset smoldering behind the western hills. Inside the family's home, the air was warm and carried the sweet, rich scent of the evening meal, a simple platter of ripe figs, their dark skins split to reveal jeweled crimson flesh, and a wedge of sharp, salty goat cheese made from their own nanny's milk. They ate in a silence that was not empty, but filled with the lingering echo of the wanderer's words. The tales of Capernaum had taken root in the quiet room, growing in the spaces between their thoughts, challenging the very foundations of their understood world. The miracles felt both impossibly distant and unsettlingly close, a divine tremor that had reached even their isolated village. Leah was the first to break the silence, her voice tentative, her eyes still wide with the wonder of it all. She whispered of the withered hand made whole, her own small fingers curling unconsciously as if feeling the phantom miracle. How could such power exist in the world, she wondered, a power that could rewrite the story of a broken body with a single touch? Samuel, ever practical, countered with the skepticism of his youth. His mind, accustomed to the tangible logic of sowing and reaping, of mending nets and fixing walls, struggled to accept such a breach of nature's laws. He spoke of the storm, a force they had all felt and feared, a power that was real and devastatingly understandable. How could a man command a force greater than the wind and waves that had so recently terrorized them? Their quiet debate wove back and forth across the low table, a tapestry of youthful faith grappling with nascent doubt, of wonder wrestling with the ingrained lessons of a hard physical life. Joseph listened to his children, his gaze thoughtful as he slowly chewed a piece of cheese. He did not dismiss Samuel's skepticism or temper Leah's hope. Instead, he saw in their words the same struggle that churned within his own heart. The traveler's stories had stirred something deep and dormant. He looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred from years of hauling nets and wrestling with the sea. They were hands that understood effort and failure, that had often returned empty after a long night's labor. He thought of their small plot of land, of the seeds they buried in the faith that rain would come and sun would coax them forth. Some seasons the soil yielded a bounty, other times it offered only meager, stunted growth despite their most careful efforts. And then, as if a lamp had been lit in a dark room, a connection sparked in his mind. He recalled a story the wanderer had mentioned in passing, a simple tale this Jesus had told of a farmer scattering seed. Some seed fell on the path and was snatched away, some on rocky soil and withered, some among thorns and was choked, but some fell on good soil and produced a magnificent harvest. It was not a story about magic or effortless bounty, but about receptivity, about the condition of the heart. Joseph saw his own life reflected in that parable. His doubts were the bird snatching the seed. His fears of poor catches and failed crops were the thorns, the rocky soil of his own discouragement. A profound calm settled over him. The miracles in Capernaum were not a suspension of God's natural order, but a revelation of its deepest truth, that divine grace was a constant, potent seed, ready to sprout wherever it found a heart prepared to receive it. His own struggles were not a sign of God's absence, but the very ground in which his faith was meant to grow. He would trust not in the certainty of a full net or a plentiful harvest, but in the goodness of the one who commanded both the sea and the sower. He would scatter his efforts, his prayers, his hopes onto the soil of each new day and leave the growth to a wisdom far greater than his own. The decision was a quiet one, a subtle realignment of his soul, a choice to stop wrestling with the mysteries of providence and instead to rest in them. The seeds of faith, he realized, were not planted in the spectacular, but in the simple, stubborn act of trust, here in the quiet of his home, surrounded by the faces of his family and the lingering sweetness of evening figs. Chapter 11. Preparing for Sabbath. The sun on Friday morning seemed to hold a different quality, its light imbued with a golden, anticipatory stillness. From the moment it crested the hills of Nazareth, the day was touched with a sacred purpose, its every hour dedicated to the hallowed transition from labor to rest. The storm's recent fury and the wanderer's wondrous tales receded into the background, replaced by the ancient comforting rhythm of preparation. The work of this day was not the toil of survival, but a deliberate, loving act of creation, the crafting of a space and time, a sanctuary of 24 hours set apart for peace. The first task fell to Miriam and the children. They took up brooms made of bundled twigs and began to sweep the packed earth floor of their home. This was no mere cleaning, it was a ritual of purification. With long, deliberate strokes, they chased the dust of the week out the low doorway, the motes dancing in the sunbeams like spirits being gently exorcised. Every corner was attended to, every cooking utensil wiped clean and neatly arranged. Leah and Samuel worked with an uncharacteristic solemnity, understanding that they were not just tidying a room, but preparing a vessel to receive the Sabbath's holiness. The air, once thick with the scents of daily life, wood smoke, dried fish, and human sweat, was gradually replaced by the clean, simple smell of freshly swept earth. With a home ordered, Miriam turned her attention to the hearth, the literal and figurative heart of their preparations. Today, she did not bake the single daily loaf. Instead, she mixed a larger batch of dough, her hands working the flour and water with a special reverence. She shaped 2 loaves, each one braided with care, a tangible symbol of the double portion of manna God had provided the Israelites in the wilderness. As the loaves baked on the hot stones, their rich, yeasty aroma filled the home, a promise of the feasts to come. This extra bread was more than food. It was an act of faith, a declaration that no work would be needed tomorrow, that God's provision was sufficient and their trust in it complete. In the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, the family walked together to the stream that ran along the edge of the village. This, too, was part of the preparation, a cleansing of the body to mirror the cleansing of the home and spirit. The water, chilled from its journey down the hills, was a shock against their skin. They waded in, scrubbing away the grime of the week with handfuls of smooth, wet sand. Laughter, light and unburdened, echoed for a moment off the stones, a brief, joyful sound before the coming quiet. They emerged feeling renewed, their skin tingling, their simple tunics damp and clean. The physical refreshment was a prelude to the spiritual rest that awaited, a shedding of the old week's weariness. As the last sliver of sun vanished behind the hills and the first stars pricked the deep blue velvet of the sky, the final, most sacred ritual began. Miriam carefully lit the Sabbath lamps, the small clay vessels filled with precious olive oil. The wicks caught, and their gentle, steady flames pushed back the gathering darkness, casting a soft, warm glow over the family's faces as they gathered around the low table. The two braided challah loaves lay under a simple cloth, and a cup of wine, a rare luxury, stood waiting. Yosef raised the cup, his voice a low, steady murmur as he recited the ancient blessing, the Kiddush, sanctifying the day. Then he placed his hands upon the heads of his children, his words a tender invocation of peace, a prayer that the divine presence felt so keenly in this moment would rest upon them and upon their home and upon all of Israel. A profound, palpable silence descended, thick with blessing. The frantic energy of the week had been stilled. The preparations were complete. In the quiet flicker of the lamps, surrounded by the ones he loved most, Yosef felt a peace that surpassed the wanderer's most miraculous tales, a deep, abiding shalom that was, in itself, the greatest miracle of all. Chapter 12. Sabbath Peace. The Sabbath morning dawned not with the usual clamor of roosters and the scrape of grinding stones, but with a profound and hallowed silence. It was a silence that felt different from the anxious stillness before the storm. This was a quiet of fulfillment, a deep, resonant peace that had been earned through a week of labor and a day of deliberate preparation. The light filtering through the high window was soft and gentle, seeming to move more slowly, as if respecting the sanctity of the day. There was no rush to rise, no urgent list of chores. The family stirred gradually, their movements languid and reverent, their voices hushed. They dressed in their cleanest tunics, the ones reserved for this day, the rough woven fabric feeling lighter against their freshly washed skin. The very air in the home seemed to have been transformed, charged with a quiet joy that made the simple act of breathing feel like a prayer. Together they walked out into the village. The familiar paths, usually trodden with purpose, were now a promenade of peace. Other families emerged from their homes, all moving in the same slow, unified flow toward the heart of the community, the synagogue. The building, a simple structure of stone and timber, seemed to gather the morning light unto itself, its unadorned facade radiating a humble dignity. As they entered through the low doorway, the cool, shadowed interior welcomed them, the scent of old wood and sun-warmed stone, a familiar comfort. They found their customary place on the woven mats. Settling into the collective stillness that filled the room, the space was not grand, but it was sacred, a vessel for the shared spirit of the village, now focused entirely on rest and worship. The Hazan, the leader of their worship, stood before the congregation, the sacred scrolls resting on the reading desk before him. As he unrolled the parchment, a ripple of attentive silence passed through the gathered families. His voice, when he began to read, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. Each word weighted with ancient authority. He read from the prophet Isaiah, the words flowing like a cool, clear stream through the quiet air. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and a holy day of the Lord honorable. The Scriptures spoke of rest as a divine commandment, not a mere cessation of work, but an active, joyous embrace of holiness. They spoke of a peace that was not passive, but a powerful force that renewed the soul and strengthened the community. The family listened, their heads bowed, the words washing over them, confirming the rightness of the stillness that enveloped their village. In the rhythmic cadence of the ancient texts, the anxieties of the storm, the doubts about provision, and the yearning for distant miracles all softened, absorbed into a larger, more enduring truth. After the service, the slow, peaceful pace continued as they returned home. The noon meal was a quiet, shared celebration. Miriam brought out the 2 braided challah loaves from the previous evening, along with a dish of honey, a pot of savory bean stew that had simmered overnight, and a bowl of the season's first grapes. The food was simple, but the act of sharing it was imbued with a special significance. There was no discussion of work to be done tomorrow, no worries about nets or gardens. Instead, they ate in comfortable silence or spoke in low tones of the beauty of the Scriptures, of the feeling of peace that settled in their bones. The meal was not about filling their stomachs, but about nourishing their connection to each other and to God, a tangible expression of the day's sacred theme. As the afternoon wore on, their neighbors, Eleazar and Ruth, the elderly couple Yosef had aided after the storm, came to visit. They moved slowly, leaning on each other, their faces etched with the lines of age, but softened by the day's peace. They brought with them a small jar of preserved dates, a sweet offering of gratitude and fellowship. They sat together in the shade outside the home, not speaking much, but sharing the companionable silence. The simple act of sitting together, of existing in a shared space without demand or expectation, was a powerful affirmation of community unity. The restored roof over the old couple's head, the shared bread on the cloth, the quiet company, all of it wove together into a single, unspoken testimony. The Sabbath was not a day of isolation, but of deepened connection, a reminder that their individual peace was inextricably linked to the peace of their neighbors. As the sun began to lower, casting long, peaceful shadows, the family felt a renewal that was more than physical. It was a settling of the spirit, a recentering in the sacred rhythm of rest that held their faith, their family, and their community in a perfect, enduring embrace. Chapter 13, Festival of First Fruits. The air in Nazareth hummed with a different energy, a vibrant current of joy that swept through the dusty streets, erasing the last lingering memories of the storm's devastation. It was the morning of the Festival of First Fruits, and the entire village pulsed with the rhythm of celebration. From every doorway, families emerged, their arms laden with the first and finest yields of their labors. Bundles of golden barley, their heads heavy with grain, were carried like scepters. Baskets overflowed with early grapes, their skins a deep, dusky purple, exuding a sweet, intoxicating fragrance that mingled with the scent of sun-warmed earth and excited voices. The offerings were not merely produce. They were tangible prayers of gratitude, the initial, most precious results of the earth's generosity, given back in a spirit of thankfulness to the God who provided the sun and the rain. The procession wound its way to the threshing floor at the village's edge, a wide, flat expanse of packed earth that now served as a sacred gathering place. In the center, a great pile of the offerings grew, a mound of gold and purple, a fragrant mountain of blessing. The village elder stood before it, his hands raised, his voice carrying over the crowd as he recited the ancient blessings, sanctifying the gifts and the givers. The atmosphere was electric with shared faith, a collective sigh of relief and joy after the season's toil and recent trials. Then the music began. A flute player started a lively skipping tune, soon joined by the rhythmic beat of a hand drum and the gentle strum of a lyre. The sound was infectious, a call to communal joy that could not be denied. Almost as one, the villagers began to dance. They formed wide, circling chains, their feet moving in practiced, joyful steps that kicked up little clouds of golden dust. Joseph and Miriam joined the circle, their movements initially stiff from work, then loosening into the rhythm, their faces breaking into wide, unburdened smiles. Leah was swept into the dance by other young girls, their laughter ringing out like bells as they spun, their colorful tunics flaring. Even Samuel, usually so serious, was pulled into the exuberant current, his small feet trying to mimic the steps, his own shy grin appearing as he was passed from hand to hand in the whirling circle. The music wove them all together, the rich and the poor, the young and the old, into a single, joyous body. Their individual worries and struggles dissolved in the collective celebration of provision. But beneath the unified joy, a subtle tension simmered. On opposite sides of the dancing circle, two men, Jared and Micah, moved with a stiffness that betrayed a deeper discord. Their fields lay adjacent, separated by a narrow, unmarked strip of land that had been a source of quiet contention for months. Each believed the other had encroached, taking a few precious handspans of soil for their own planting. Harsh words had been exchanged after the storm, accusations flying about, shifted boundary stones and stolen sunlight for young vines. They avoided each other's gaze now, their participation in the festival a duty rather than a delight. The dispute a small, hard stone in the shoe of the community's peace. As the dancing reached its peak and the music softened, the time came for the shared feast. Long trestle tables, rough-hewn from local wood, were laden with the bounty. There was barley stew, rich with herbs, flatbreads drizzled with the first pressing of olive oil, and great clay bowls heaped with the sweet, sacrificial grapes. The villagers gathered, their faces flushed and happy, filling their plates and finding places to sit on blankets spread upon the ground. It was in this moment of communal abundance, with the taste of shared blessing on every tongue, that the elder, his eyes wise and perceptive, called for Jared and Micah to come forward. A hush fell over the gathering. He did not ask them to argue their case. Instead, he gestured to the feast around them, to the faces of their families, to the mountain of first fruits that represented the grace bestowed upon them all. He spoke not of boundaries and property, but of the soil that belonged to God, of the rain that fell on the fields of both the just and the unjust, of the shared vulnerability they had all faced during the storm and the shared labor of the recovery. He held up a cluster of grapes from Jared's vineyard and a sheaf of barley from Micah's field. "Can we," he asked, his voice gentle but firm, "who offer these first gifts from the same generous earth, truly hold a grudge over the dirt from which they sprang?" The two men stood in silence, the truth of his words settling upon them, made undeniable by the context of the feast. The anger that had felt so righteous in isolation now seemed petty amidst the overwhelming evidence of God's provision. Jared looked at the bread on his plate, made from grain like Micah's. Micah tasted the wine, pressed from grapes like Jared's. Their dispute, once a matter of principle, now felt like a failure of gratitude. Without a word, Jared turned to Micah, his posture softening. He gestured toward the contested strip of land and made a simple, sweeping motion with his hand, offering it. Micah, his own defensiveness crumbling, shook his head and instead placed a hand on Jared's shoulder, a gesture of reconciliation. They would share it, they decided then and there, planting it together the next season as a testament to the peace forged on this day. The resolution was not a legal victory, but a triumph of shared spirit, a conflict dissolved not by force, but by the overwhelming power of a gratitude that reminded them they were first and foremost neighbors and children of the same generous God. The feast that followed tasted all the sweeter for the mended rift, the music all the more joyful, the bonds of the community strengthened by a forgiveness born from the shared celebration of the first fruits. Chapter 14. A Child's Curiosity. The quiet of the evening was a soft blanket settling over Nazareth after the vibrant chaos of the festival. Inside the family's home, the last of the day's light bled through the high window, painting the room in shades of deep gold and lingering violet. The air still carried the faint, sweet scent of the feast's grapes and the memory of communal joy. Yet, in the gentle hush, a different kind of energy stirred, one born not of celebration, but of a young mind grappling with the infinite. Samuel sat near the cooling hearth, his small frame curled, his brow furrowed in a familiar knot of concentration. The psalms sung at the festival, the prayers offered for the first fruits, the very concept of a God who received their gifts, it all swirled in his head, beautiful but baffling. He looked from the solid mud brick walls of his home to the emerging stars in the darkening square of the window, and the question that had been simmering within him finally found its voice, soft and earnest, in the twilight. Why, he wondered aloud, did they pour out their hearts in prayer to a presence they could not see, could not touch, a God who remained hidden behind a vast, silent curtain of the sky? Miriam, who had been folding a blanket, paused her work. She did not dismiss his question as childish impertinence, but saw it for what it was, the first tender shoot of a deep and seeking faith breaking through the soil of his understanding. She moved to sit beside him, her movements calm and deliberate. She did not look toward the heavens for her answer, but down at the earth-packed floor near her feet. With a gentle finger, she traced a small circle in the dust. From a tiny pouch at her belt, she produced a single, minuscule mustard seed, placing it in the center of the circle. It was a speck, a barely there fleck of potential held between her thumb and forefinger. She showed it to Samuel, its insignificance stark in her palm. This, she explained with a quiet intensity, was like faith itself. It was the smallest of all the seeds they knew, so easy to overlook, so simple to lose. Yet, she continued, her voice a low, melodic thread weaving through the quiet room, when this tiny, unseen thing was entrusted to the good soil, when it was watered by the rains they could not command and warmed by a sun they did not kindle, a miracle occurred in the hidden darkness beneath the surface. A force they could not see took hold, a silent, patient power that coaxed the hard shell to split and a fragile green tendril to push upward, fighting its way toward the light. That tiny seed, invisible in its potential, would become the greatest of all the garden plants. A sturdy shrub with branches strong enough for birds to nest in. They could not see the growth happening, just as they could not see the wind that bent the branches, but they saw its undeniable results. Their prayers, their trust, were like that seed, she said. They were planting something small and unseen in the fertile soil of their hearts, trusting in a divine warmth and nourishment they could not control, believing that in time it would grow into a sheltering presence far greater than they could imagine, a strength they could lean on even when the storms came. Joseph, who had been listening from the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the last of the dusk, now stepped into the circle of dim light. He had been mending a small tear in his cloak, but he set the needle aside. He saw the thoughtful look on his son's face and recognized the need for another kind of language, one drawn from his own world of water and mystery. He came and sat on Samuel's other side, his presence solid and reassuring. He spoke then of his net, of the moment of casting it into the deep, dark waters of the sea. He described the feeling of the coarse rope in his hands, the sight of the woven circle flying out and vanishing beneath the surface. For those long, uncertain moments, he said, he could see nothing of what was happening below. He could not see if the fish was swimming into his trap or avoiding it. He had only the feel of the rope, the patience in his heart, and the faith that his labor would not be in vain. His entire act, from the mending of the net to the final hopeful cast, was a prayer, he explained. It was a trust placed in the unseen bounty of the deep, a belief that there was a provision waiting in the darkness, a harvest his eyes could not witness until the very moment he began to pull the net back, heavy and straining, into the light. He did not command a fish to enter his net any more than they commanded the mustard seed to grow. He simply did his part, the mending, the rowing, the casting, and then he waited with a heart full of hope for the unseen to be revealed. Their prayers were like that cast net, he said, his voice a low rumble. They were an act of trust sent into the deep, vast mystery of God's will. They could not see the answer forming, just as he could not see the fish gathering below, but they had to believe that the pull would come, that the harvest would appear in its own time and in its own way. The proof was not in the seeing, but in the faithful act of casting the net, day after day, and in the patient waiting for the tug on the line. Samuel looked from his mother's gentle hands, which had held the tiny seed, to his father's strong, scarred ones, which knew the feel of the rope and the weight in the darkness. The abstract concept of an unseen God suddenly felt less distant, less nebulous. It was woven into the very fabric of their lives, in the hidden growth of a seed, in the patient hope of a fisherman on a vast sea. His confusion did not vanish entirely, but it was gentled, soothed by these tangible pictures of a faith that worked in the unseen realms of earth and water. He leaned back against his father's side, the solid warmth a comfort. The question had not been answered with a simple fact, but with a deeper understanding that faith itself was a kind of sight, a way of perceiving a reality that was just as true, just as powerful as the mud brick walls around them, a reality built on trust in the growth they could not see and the harvest waiting in the deep. Chapter 15, The Healer's Touch. The first sign was a stillness where there should have been movement. Old Ezra, who could always be found puttering outside his small dwelling at dawn, weeding his herb patch or mending a stool, was absent. His door remained closed, an unusual sight in a village where the boundaries between home and community were as porous as the limestone bedrock. The news traveled through Nazareth on hushed, concerned tones, passed from one woman to another at the well, from one man to another as they inspected their storm-mended roofs. Ezra had been taken by a fever in the night, a burning, relentless heat that had left him weak and delirious, his usually cheerful voice reduced to incoherent mutterings. In a community so tightly woven, the illness of one was a snag in the fabric of all, a shared vulnerability that called for a collective response. Miriam heard the news with a familiar, sobering pang. She had seen such fevers before, knew their capricious nature, how they could break as suddenly as they arrived, or cling to a body with a terrifying tenacity. Without a word, she turned from her morning tasks and went to the small shaded patch of earth behind her home that served as her garden of simples. Here she grew not just vegetables for the table, but the green allies of the healer, the pungent rosemary for cleansing, the fuzzy leaves of sage for soothing throats, the bright flowers of chamomile for calming restlessness. Her hands, knowledgeable and gentle, moved among the plants, selecting with a practiced eye. She harvested sprigs of thyme, known for its power to fight the putrid humors of fever, and the sharp-scented leaves of mint to cool the skin and clear the head. She worked with the quiet reverence, her actions a silent prayer, each plucked leaf a plea for its efficacy. Back inside, she set a small pot of water to boil over the hearth. The fragrant herbs soon filled the home with a sharp, clean aroma, a stark contrast to the imagined scent of sickness clinging to Ezra's dwelling. She prepared a strong infusion, a tea to be forced between the old man's cracked lips in small, patient sips. She also made a poultice, crushing the herbs with a stone and mixing them with a little olive oil into a pungent green paste that would be applied to his chest and forehead, a direct, cooling assault on the internal fire. Her preparations were methodical, devoid of panic, a calm center in the growing anxiety of the village. She was not a miracle worker like the man from Capernaum, but she was a steward of the earth's own remedies, and her work was an extension of her faith, a belief that God provided healing not only in spectacular acts, but in the quiet virtues of leaf and root, and in the hands willing to administer them. While Miriam prepared her remedies, the rhythm of care was already establishing itself around Ezra's home. Joseph was among the first to arrive, his strong presence a bulwark against the helplessness that illness brings. He found the old man's water jars empty and carried them to the well, returning with fresh, cool water. He then set about quietly repairing a loose shutter that rattled in the breeze, his hammer blows soft and rhythmic, a sound of normalcy and order imposed upon the chaotic space of sickness. Later, other villagers took their turns. The women came with bowls of broth and freshly baked bread, leaving them just inside the door with whispered blessings. The men stopped by to sit in silent vigil for a while, their presence a comfort to Ezra's worried family. Children were tasked with keeping the path to his home clear and fetching anything that was needed. No one organized this. It was the village's innate, unspoken understanding of community, a living embodiment of a belief that they were all members of one body, and when one member suffered, all suffered with it. For 3 days the fever held Ezra in its grip, a stubborn, shimmering haze that refused to break. The family and the villagers maintained their watch, a relay of compassion that ran through the heart of Nazareth. Miriam came multiple times a day to administer her teas and change the poultices. Her touch, as gentle as her resolve, was firm. Joseph continued his small acts of maintenance, ensuring the home was secure and the family had firewood. Others came simply to sit, to pray, to be a quiet witness to the struggle. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, a change came. The oppressive heat that had radiated from Ezra's skin began to recede, like a tide pulling back from a scorched shore. His breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, deepened into the slow, regular rhythm of true sleep. The mutterings ceased, replaced by a peaceful silence. When he finally awoke, his eyes were clear, though shadowed with exhaustion. The fever had broken. The news spread through Nazareth not with shouts of triumph, but with a deep, collective exhalation of relief, a silent shared joy that was more profound for the fear that had preceded it. As Ezra slowly regained his strength, propped up on his pallet and sipping the broths his neighbors brought, the atmosphere in the village seemed to shift. The shared vigil, the collective worry, and the joyful outcome had done more than nurse one old man back to health. It had reaffirmed their fundamental interconnectedness. They had not witnessed a dramatic Capernaum-style miracle, but they had been part of a different kind of healing, one woven from thyme and mint, from carried water and shared bread, from silent prayers and the steadfast presence of neighbors. In caring for Ezra, they had cared for their own communal soul, and his recovery felt like a divine affirmation of their way of life. Their faith was strengthened not by a distant wonder, but by the tangible, miraculous power of their own healer's touch and the unwavering support of the community that held them all. Chapter 16, Joseph's Trial. The Sea of Galilee, usually a giver of life, had become a vast, shimmering plate of refusal. For the 3rd dawn in a row, Joseph rowed back toward the shore of Nazareth, his muscles aching with a fatigue that was more than physical. The bottom of his boat was not silvered with the frantic flapping of a good catch, but held only the damp, dark wood and a few scattered, glistening scales from days past, ghosts of former bounty. His net, meticulously mended and carefully cast, lay in a heavy, sodden coil, its emptiness a tangible weight in the pit of his stomach. Each pull of the oars was a struggle not against the waves, which were mercifully calm, but against a rising tide of despair within him. The other fishermen's boats were dots on the water around him, and though he could not see their holds, the set of their shoulders and the slow, defeated rhythm of their rowing told a universal story of scarcity. The sea had closed its mouth, and the village's primary sustenance had been cut off. He beached the boat with a final grinding heave, the sound of wood on stone, a hollow echo of his frustration. He did not coil the net with his usual care, but dragged it up the shore and dropped it in a tangled heap. The walk back through the village felt longer than ever, the dust kicking up around his sandals, feeling like the ashes of his hopes. He passed neighbors who offered sympathetic nods, their own worry etched on their faces, but their silent pity only sharpened the sting of his failure. He was the provider, the strong back and capable hands upon which his family relied. The memory of the storm's aftermath, of his strength used to help others, now felt like a cruel joke. What good was that strength if he could not pull a simple, living bounty from the water? What good was faith if it returned to him again and again an empty net? Inside the dim, cool quiet of his home, he did not meet Miriam's eyes as she looked up from her weaving. He simply shook his head, a small, tight gesture that conveyed everything. He saw the fleeting shadow of concern cross her face before it was replaced by her usual serene composure, and that, too, felt like a condemnation. He moved to the far corner of the room and sat heavily on a low stool, his hands hanging limp between his knees. He stared at the packed earth floor, but he did not see it. He saw the dark, empty water, the futile casts, the growing fear in his children's eyes if this continued. The prayers he had whispered on the boat, the songs of trust he had sung in his heart, felt like words thrown into a void, swallowed by the same silence that had greeted his net. As dusk fell, he could no longer bear the confines of the four walls that seemed to press in on his failure. He slipped outside into the cooling air and walked to the small hill that overlooked the village and the sea beyond. The sky was clear, a deep, endless indigo, slowly filling with the sharp, brilliant pinpricks of stars. He stood there, a solitary figure against the immensity of the night, and looked up. The stars were countless, ancient, and coldly beautiful, their patterns unchanging and indifferent. They were the same stars Abraham had seen, the same that had witnessed the Exodus, the same that had looked down on countless other fishermen returning with empty nets. The vast, silent, impersonal cosmos seemed to mock the smallness of his worries, the fragility of his faith. A cold knot of doubt tightened in his chest, more terrifying than any storm. Was God truly a caring Father, attentive to the sparrows' fall and the number of hairs on their heads? Or was he like these distant stars, a majestic but remote creator who had set the world in motion and now observed its struggles with detached, cosmic silence? The prayers, the rituals, the trust, were they all just a comforting story they told themselves to make the hunger and the fear more bearable? He had always believed his labor was a partnership with the divine, the casting of the net, an act of faith that would be met with provision. Now it felt like a monologue, his hopeful efforts met only with the unyielding emptiness of the sea and the cold, silent gaze of the stars. The foundation of his world, built on the rock of a caring providence, felt like it was crumbling into sand, leaving him standing alone in a vast, uncaring universe, his hands empty and his heart full of a despair as deep and dark as the waters that had failed him. Chapter 17. Miriam's Resolve. The silence in their home was a heavy, suffocating shroud, thick with the scent of Joseph's despair. He sat in the corner where he had retreated, his broad shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on nothing, as if he could still see the mocking emptiness of his net reflected in the packed earth floor. The sturdy provider, the quiet anchor of their family, seemed hollowed out, a vessel filled only with the bitter dregs of failure. Miriam watched him from her place by the cooling hearth, her heart aching with a familiar protective pang. She had seen this shadow descend upon him before, in the lean seasons and after the storm, but this felt different, deeper, a crisis not of circumstance, but of spirit. The cold doubt he had brought back from the sea was seeping into the very walls of their home, threatening to extinguish the light of his faith. She rose, her movements fluid and silent, and crossed the room to him. She did not speak empty words of reassurance, nor did she try to coax him from his gloom with false cheer. Instead, she knelt before him, her work-roughened hands covering his own, which lay limp and cold in his lap. Her touch was a gentle anchor, pulling him back from the edge of the vast, star-chilled emptiness that had consumed him. She began to speak, her voice a low, steady melody in the oppressive quiet. She did not speak of the empty nets or the uncertain future. She spoke of the past, weaving a tapestry of remembered blessings, each one a sturdy thread in the fabric of their lives. She reminded him of the morning the donkey had given birth to a healthy foal against all odds, a sudden gift of strength for their household. She recalled the season when the barley, threatened by blight, had been spared by a sudden shift in the wind, their prayers answered not with a shout, but with a whisper. She spoke of Samuel's fever breaking on the third night, of Leah's laughter after she had mastered a difficult weaving pattern, of a community that had rallied around them after the storm. Each memory was a small, defiant flame held up against the darkness of his doubt, a reminder that their history was not a chronicle of want, but a testimony of provision, often arriving in the 11th hour in ways they could never have predicted. Then, still holding his hands, she bowed her head. Her prayer was not a plea for a miraculous catch on the morrow, but a quiet litany of gratitude for the hand she held, for the children sleeping peacefully nearby, for the roof over their heads, and the herbs in her garden. It was a prayer that acknowledged their need, but rested in the certainty of past deliverance. After a moment, Yosef's fingers twitched beneath hers, then tightened, grasping her hands as a drowning man grasps a rope. A single hot tear fell from his bowed head and splashed onto their joined hands, a silent admission of his struggle and a first fragile step back toward the shore of his faith. As the moon rose, casting a soft silver light through the high window, Miriam began to share a story from her own youth, a tale she had seldom spoken aloud. She described a drought that had gripped the land for 2 long years, a time when the wells gave only mud and the dust storms choked the air. Her own father, a potter, had seen his clay dry out and crack, his livelihood crumble into dust in his hands. He had stared at the barren, cracked earth, much as Joseph had stared at the empty sea, his own resolve withering. But her mother, she said, her voice softening with the memory, had taken a single hardened date pit, the last of their store. She had planted it in a cracked jar of dry, seemingly useless soil. Every day she poured onto it the few precious drops of her own water ration, a seemingly foolish, wasteful act. For weeks, nothing happened. The pit remained a hard, brown speck in a jar of dust. But her mother never ceased. And then, one morning, a tiny, impossible sliver of green had pierced the hard shell, a stubborn declaration of life against all odds. That tiny shoot, Miriam said, her eyes holding Joseph's in the moonlight, had not ended the drought, but it had rekindled her father's spirit. It had reminded him that life was a force of relentless resilience, and that their task was not to command rain, but to faithfully pour their few drops of hope onto the hard ground, trusting that the growth, when it came, would be a miracle in itself. Her story was not about a sudden, dramatic rescue, but about the unwavering belief that made rescue possible. The quiet, daily resolve to plant the seed even in the dust, to cast the net even on an empty sea. In the shared silence that followed, under the patient gaze of the moon, Yosef felt the cold knot of despair in his chest begin, slowly, to loosen, warmed by the steady, unwavering flame of his wife's resolve. Chapter 18. Journey to Jerusalem. The road to Jerusalem was a river of dust and devotion, a winding, sun-bleached ribbon of earth churned to fine powder by the sandaled feet of countless pilgrims. For the family from Nazareth, joining the throng was like stepping into a living current of faith, their individual lives swept up into a grand collective purpose. The air itself was thick with the scent of this movement, the dry, chalky smell of the path, the musky odor of packed bodies and damp wool, the sharp tang of donkey dung, and the occasional sweet whiff of incense from a wealthier traveler's pack. They moved in a loose caravan, a sprawling, multicolored tapestry of humanity flowing southward, their voices a low, constant hum of psalms, conversations, and the crying of infants, all rising like a single, hopeful prayer into the vast azure sky. Samuel's excitement was a palpable force, a bright, buzzing energy that made it impossible for him to walk in a straight line. He darted from one side of the path to the other, his small feet kicking up puffs of pale dust. His eyes, wide with wonder, drank in every new sight. The striped robes of merchants from Damascus, the stern-faced Roman soldiers on patrol who watched the river of pilgrims with detached suspicion, the flocks of sheep being driven to the same destination for sacrifice, their plaintive bleats adding to the symphony of the road. He pointed at everything, his questions tumbling out in a breathless stream, each new face and strange accent a thrilling confirmation that the world was far larger and more wondrous than the familiar boundaries of Nazareth. For him, the journey was not a trial but a grand adventure, each step bringing him closer to the heart of his people's story, to the holy city he had only ever heard described in scriptures and his father's reverent tales. Joseph and Miriam walked with a steadier, more measured pace, their bodies fallen into the ancient rhythm of the pilgrim. Joseph carried a stout staff and led their donkey, which was laden with their provisions, sacks of bread, dried fish, a skin of water, and the simple, unblemished lamb they would offer at the temple. His eyes, accustomed to reading the moods of the sea, now scanned the horizons and the faces of their fellow travelers, a quiet vigilance born of his role as protector. Miriam walked beside him, a water-skin in her hand, her gaze taken in the weary, the joyful, the devout. She saw a young mother soothing a fretful child, an old man being supported by his sons, a group of scholars debating a fine point of the law as they walked. This river of humanity, with all its varied struggles and hopes, felt like a tangible expression of the covenant, a nation on the move to meet its God. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, beats down with a relentless dry heat, a disruption rippled through the edge of their traveling group. A panicked, high-pitched bleating cut through the general murmur, and a small fuzzy white lamb, its eyes wide with terror, broke from a larger flock being driven by a harried shepherd boy. It scrambled through a thicket of dry, thorny bushes at the side of the road, its frantic movements sending up clouds of dust. The boy cried out in despair, but he dared not leave the main body of his flock to chase the single runaway, his face a mask of helpless anguish. The lost lamb stumbled into a narrow, rocky gully, its cries growing more frantic and isolated as it realized its separation. It was Samuel who saw it first. His adventurous darting had taken him near the gully, and the pitiful sound caught his ear. He stopped his aimless running and peered over the edge. The little creature was trapped, bleating miserably as it tried and failed to scramble up the steep, crumbling sides. Without a second thought, Samuel scrambled down into the gully, ignoring the sharp rocks that scraped his knees. He moved slowly, his earlier excitement replaced by a gentle, focused calm. He spoke in a low, soothing murmur, the same tone his mother used when one of their own goats was frightened. The lamb, exhausted and terrified, stopped its frantic struggling and stared at the boy with wide, liquid, dark eyes. Samuel carefully gathered the trembling animal into his arms. It was heavier than he expected, a warm, beating weight of pure fear. He clutched it tightly, feeling its rapid heartbeat against his own chest, and began the difficult climb back up, using his free hand to find purchase on the rocky wall. Joseph, seeing his son's mission, was there at the top, his strong hand reaching down to haul them both to safety. Without a word, father and son carried the lamb back to the road, to the overwhelmed shepherd boy whose face transformed from despair to incredulous relief. The boy took the lamb, his grateful hands gentle as he checked it for injury before returning it to the safety of the flock. The lamb, once lost and alone, immediately merged back into the sea of white wool, its frightened bleats ceasing as it found the comfort of its own kind. No grand words were exchanged. The shepherd boy offered a nod, his eyes shining with thanks, and Joseph returned it with a quiet smile. But as they fell back into the rhythm of the journey, Samuel walked differently. He no longer darted, but kept close to his family, his small hand finding his father's. The thrill of the adventure had been replaced by a deeper, warmer feeling, the profound satisfaction of having restored something that was lost. He looked at the great flock moving ahead of them, a single, unified body heading toward sacrifice. And he understood, in a way no scripture could ever teach him, the value of every single member. The dust of the road still coated his skin, and the sun still beat down, but his heart felt light. The simple, compassionate act of returning a lost lamb to its flock, a sacred offering in itself, a perfect prelude to the Passover they traveled to celebrate. Chapter 19. In the Holy City. The scent of Jerusalem was a layered, potent incense that assaulted the senses long before its walls came into view, a heady mixture of sun-baked stone, dust, and humanity, overlaid with the sharp metallic tang of blood and the rich, greasy smoke of countless sacrifices. As the family from Nazareth crested the final hill, the city itself rose before them, a breathtaking, impossible vision of white and gold shimmering in the midday heat. The massive, honey-colored stones of the temple complex dominated the skyline, its gilded roofs catching the sun and blazing with a light that felt both divine and daunting. But the true shock was the noise. The gentle murmur of their pilgrim band was swallowed by a roaring, chaotic symphony of commerce and devotion. The narrow streets were a seething river of people, a press of bodies so dense it seemed to have its own current, carrying them forward through a canyon of stalls and shouting merchants. The air vibrated with the cries of money changers clinking their coins, the bleating of sheep and lowing of cattle being driven to their fate, and the fervent prayers of pilgrims from every corner of the world, all converging on this single sacred point. They were swept along in the human tide, their small provincial unit dissolving into the overwhelming whole. Samuel clung tightly to his father's tunic, his earlier excitement replaced by a wide-eyed awe at the sheer scale of it all. Leah pressed close to Miriam, her senses overwhelmed by the jostling crowds and the cacophony. They passed through the towering gates and into the vast outer courtyard of the temple itself, the court of the Gentiles. Here the sacred and the profane collided with a jarring intensity. The air was thick with the smoke of sacrifices, a sweet, cloying scent that clung to the back of the throat. The stone pavement underfoot was slick in places, and the sound of ritual slaughter from the inner courts was a constant grim percussion beneath the din of the crowd. It was a place of raw, unvarnished faith, a bustling, messy, and overwhelming testament to the power this city held over the hearts of millions. And then, as they moved through the crowded porticos, seeking a moment's respite from the crush, they found a pocket of profound stillness. A crowd had gathered not in the frantic, jostling manner of the marketplace, but in a hushed, attentive semicircle. In the center, seated on the steps with the afternoon sun warming the stones around him, was a man. He was not dressed in the fine robes of the priests or the scribes, and he carried no scrolls. His authority came from a different source, radiating from his calm posture and the quiet intensity in his eyes. This, they realized with a collective silent intake of breath, was the man from the traveler's tales. This was Jesus. He was teaching, but his words were not the complex legal arguments of the temple scholars. They were simple, direct, and landed in a heart with the force of a forgotten truth. He spoke of love, not the conditional tribal love they knew, but a radical, all-encompassing love that extended even to one's enemies. He spoke of a father who ran to welcome a prodigal son, of a shepherd who left 99 sheep to find the one that was lost. His voice, though not loud, carried through the colonnade with a strange, penetrating clarity. Each word a clean, cool stone dropped into the murky waters of their souls. He spoke of a kingdom not of gold and power, but of the heart, a kingdom where the poor in spirit and the pure in heart were the truly blessed. The family stood at the edge of the crowd, caught in the spell of his message. The smell of sacrifices, the jangle of coins, the distant bleating of lambs, it all faded into a distant hum. All that existed was this man and the staggering, beautiful, impossible vision he painted of a God whose primary language was not judgment, but love. A profound awe settled over them, a feeling that they were witnessing not just a teacher, but the very heart of the faith they had traveled so far to celebrate, laid bare and pulsing with a grace more breathtaking than all the gold and marble of the holy city. Chapter 20, The Return Path. The dust of Jerusalem clung to their sandals and the hems of their tunics, a fine pale powder that seemed a tangible residue of the city's holy chaos. But as the family turned their backs on the golden temple and the roaring crowds, setting their faces toward the familiar hills of Galilee, a different kind of dust settled upon them, the quiet dust of the homeward path, a powder of reflection and integration. The journey back was slower, more contemplative than the eager pilgrimage south. The initial excitement had been spent, replaced by a deep, humming stillness in each of their hearts, a silence filled with the echoing words of the teacher in the temple courtyard. The memory of his voice, speaking of a love that defied all reason and a forgiveness that knew no bounds, walked with them on the road, a silent sixth member of their traveling party. Joseph's thoughts, as he led the donkey with a steady hand, were not on the terrain, but on the landscape of his own soul. The teacher's parable of the unmerciful servant, a story of a man forgiven an immense debt who then refused to forgive a paltry one, had struck him with the force of a physical blow. It had unearthed a memory he had long buried, a grudge held against a cousin over a disputed piece of family land, a bitterness that had festered for years, creating a coldness where there should have been kinship. He had always justified it, clothed it in the respectable robes of principle and injured pride. But under the piercing clarity of the teacher's message, that justification crumbled into dust, as fine and worthless as the dust on the road. He saw his grudge for what it was, a heavy stone he had been carrying, a weight that bowed his own spirit far more than it burdened the one he resented. Letting go felt not like a loss, but like setting down a crushing load he had forgotten he was carrying. The forgiveness he had been offered by God, the unearned grace that was the foundation of his faith, demanded that he, in turn, extend that same grace. It was a debt of the heart, and the teacher's words had called it due. As the sun began its descent, painting the rocky hills in shades of rose and amber, they stopped to rest by a small, clear spring that bubbled from a crack in the stone. The children splashed their dusty faces while Miriam unpacked bread and cheese. It was in this peaceful interlude, with the cool water a blessing on their skin, that Leah, usually so quiet and observant, found her voice. The stories of the healer from Capernaum, which had first ignited a spark of hope in her, had been fanned into a steady flame by the teacher's message of radical love in Jerusalem. She looked at her hands, small and capable like her mother's, and then out at the world around them. She spoke not of grand, distant miracles, but of the small, immediate suffering she saw in Nazareth, the loneliness of the widows, the weariness of the overburdened, the quiet despair in the eyes of those who felt unseen. The teacher's words had given her a new lens through which to see her own purpose. Her dream, she confessed in a voice soft but firm with newfound conviction, was not for a husband or a home of her own, but to have hands that helped. She wanted to be like the woman in the stories who reached out to touch the hem of the teacher's cloak, an agent of that same compassionate power, however small her own version might be. She wanted to carry water for the weary, to sit with the lonely, to use the skills her mother had taught her, the weaving, the healing herbs, not just for her family, but as an offering to anyone in need. It was a quiet, practical sanctity she envisioned, a life where faith was made visible not in dramatic signs, but in the steady, humble work of easing another's burden. Her dream was a prayer made of action, a direct and heartfelt response to the message of love that now guided their footsteps home. Chapter 21. Home again. The familiar scent of Nazareth was a balm to their travel-weary souls, the dry, clean smell of sun-baked earth, the faint herbal tang of wild thyme crushed underfoot, the simple, honest odor of their own mud brick home after days filled with the overwhelming incense of the holy city. Stepping back across their threshold was not a return to a lesser life, but a homecoming to a sacred reality. The grandeur of the temple and the seething energy of Jerusalem's crowds had been awe-inspiring, but they were a symphony. Nazareth was the quiet, steady melody that underpinned it all, the foundational truth to which they now returned. The journey had changed them, etching the teacher's words upon their hearts. And now the true work began, the work of weaving those celestial threads into the humble, sturdy fabric of their daily existence. The morning after their return dawned with a clarity that felt newly washed. Joseph rose and went directly to the corner where his fishing net lay, not in the tangled heap of his earlier despair, but as an object awaiting his renewed attention. He carried it outside into the soft, golden light and spread it across his lap, the coarse, familiar fibers a comfort to his hands. The memory of the empty catches and the cold despair on the hill under the stars was still there, but it was now overlaid with the warmth of Miriam's resolve and the teacher's startling message of a father's boundless care. His hands began their work, the needle darting in and out, each pull of the cord a meditation, a prayer of a different kind. It was no longer a plea born of desperation, but an act of patient, faithful participation. He mended the tears not with the frantic energy of one trying to force a bounty from the sea, but with the calm diligence of a man trusting in a provision beyond his control. His patience was a tangible force, a quiet strength that filled the small yard. This net was his offering, his daily cast into the mystery of God's will, and he would mend it with care, row out with hope, and accept whatever the deep held for him with a heart schooled in gratitude, not fear. Inside, Miriam moved to her small garden, her hands itching for the feel of the soil. The journey had been rich with spirit, but her soul craved the grounding touch of the earth. Her herbs had weathered their absence, the rosemary standing tall and pungent, the sage leaves a soft, fuzzy gray-green, the mint threatening to sprawl beyond its bounds with its usual vigorous life. She knelt, her fingers delving into the cool, damp soil beneath the sun-warmed surface. She weeded with a tender precision, her touch a blessing on each plant. This was her altar, this small patch of ground. Tending it was her act of worship, a collaboration with the divine force that caused the seed to split and the leaf to unfurl. The teacher's words about the lilies of the field, how they neither toiled nor spun, yet were clothed in a glory surpassing Solomon's, resonated deeply as she worked. Her care for these plants was not an anxious striving, but a loving stewardship, a way of partnering with that same generous providence. She watered them not with worry, but with faith, trusting that her careful tending would be met with the earth's innate generosity, that these leaves would one day cool a fever or bring flavor to a simple meal. In the quiet rhythm of her work, the grand themes of love and forgiveness from Jerusalem found their practical, rooted expression, a faith applied not in the spectacular, but in the patient, loving care of the ordinary. Chapter 22. The Shared Table. The bounty of the harvest was a tangible prayer answered, a golden abundance that transformed the very air of Nazareth. The threshing floors, once a scene of frantic labor, now lay quiet, their work complete. In their place, the heart of the village beat with a different, warmer rhythm, centered around the great, long tables, assembled in a square from planks and trestles. The late afternoon sun poured honeyed light over the scene, gilding the dust motes that danced above the bustling preparations. The entire village moved with a shared joyful purpose, their faces softened by the relief and gratitude of a season that had, against the odds of storm and doubt, yielded its goodness. This was not merely a meal, it was a sacrament of community, a collective sigh of thanksgiving for the earth's faithfulness and their own survival. The tables groaned under the weight of their shared providence. Great earthenware pots steamed with thick, savory lentil stew, redolent with cumin and garlic, each spoonful a taste of the soil they had all tended. Platters were piled high with flatbreads, their surfaces blistered from the hearth, ready to be torn and dipped. There were bowls of glistening olives, dishes of goat cheese drizzled with oil, and baskets heaped with the last of the season's figs and pomegranates, their cracked skins revealing jeweled interiors. The scents wove together into a single intoxicating perfume of roasted grain, simmering legumes, and wood smoke, a feast for the senses that promised deep satisfaction. Laughter rang out, free and unburdened, punctuating the low hum of conversation as neighbors carried their contributions to the table, each dish a thread in the vibrant tapestry of their shared life. As the last of the daylight began to soften into twilight, and the villagers started to find their places on the benches and blankets, a lone figure appeared at the edge of the square. He was a stranger, his cloak travel-stained and thin, his posture weary, his face shadowed with the dust of a long road. He hesitated, a solitary silhouette against the fading sky, an outsider observing the intimate joy of the feast. His presence sent a ripple of quiet curiosity through the gathering. Whispers passed from one person to another, questions hanging in the air about his origin and his purpose. In a world where travelers could bring trouble as easily as news, a moment of collective hesitation held the village in its grip. But the spirit of the harvest, the very reason for their gathering, would not allow that hesitation to harden into exclusion. It was old Eleazar, the man whose roof Yosef had mended, who first moved. Pushing himself up from his seat with a grunt, he picked up a wooden cup, filled it with wine from a central jar, and walked slowly toward the stranger. He did not speak, merely offered the cup with a hand that trembled slightly with age, his eyes holding a simple, unspoken welcome. That single act was a signal. The spell of uncertainty broke. Yosef rose and gestured toward an empty space on a bench near his family. Miriam immediately filled a wooden bowl with the hot lentil stew and placed a piece of bread beside it, her actions fluid and certain. The stranger, his wary expression melting into stunned gratitude, was gently ushered into the heart of the celebration. He was given a place of honor. Food was pressed upon him, and a cup was kept full. At first, he ate in quiet rapture, the simple, hearty stew a profound luxury after his journey. But as the warmth of the food and the acceptance of the people seeped into his bones, he began to speak. His voice, initially rough from disuse, grew stronger as he shared tales of the world beyond their hills, of trade routes along the great sea, of cities built of white stone, of the strange customs of people who lived by different laws. He was not a prophet or a healer, just a man, yet his stories were a gift offered in return for their hospitality, expanding the walls of their village to encompass distant horizons. The children, especially Samuel and Leah, listened with rapt attention, their own world growing larger with every word. The feast, which had been a celebration of their own harvest, became a window to the wider world, a reminder that they were part of a vast, interconnected human family. The laughter and stories flowed freely around the stranger, who was a stranger no longer, but a guest, a brother welcome to the table. In the flickering light of the oil lamps that now dotted the square, the shared meal became a living parable. The loaves and stew, a tangible expression of a faith that did not build walls but extended a hand, embodying a hospitality that saw every hungry traveler as a hidden blessing and every shared table as a foretaste of a kingdom built on generosity and grace. Chapter 23, Parables of the Land. The morning sun laid a gentle golden hand upon the small patch of earth behind the family's home, a plot of land that was both pantry and prayer, a testament to a patient partnership between human effort and divine grace. Joseph knelt in the rich, dark soil, the scent of damp earth and green, growing things of familiar incense. Beside him, Samuel watched, his young face a canvas of earnest curiosity. In his small cupped hands he held a collection of seeds, tiny, hard promises of future sustenance, each one a vessel of dormant life. Joseph took a single seed from the boy's palm, holding it between his own thick, calloused fingers, a speck of potential against a lifetime of labor. This, he explained, his voice a low, steady rumble like distant thunder, was where faith began. Not in the grand temple or the dramatic miracle, but here, in the simple, terrifying act of letting go. To bury this tiny, hard-won treasure in the dark, unknown earth felt like an act of madness, a surrender of something certain for a hope entirely unseen. He showed Samuel how to make a small furrow with his finger, to place the seed within, and to cover it gently with the cool, dark soil. It was a burial, a tiny, symbolic death. Once hidden, they had no power to command it. They could not force the shell to crack or the pale-seeking root to descend. They could only wait. Joseph's gaze lifted from the soil to the vast empty bowl of the sky, a brilliant, cloudless blue that offered no promise of rain. He spoke of the rains, how they fell on the fields of the just and the unjust alike, a gift that could not be earned, only received. They could pray for it, hope for it, prepare the soil for it, but they could not command a single drop from the heavens. Their work was to sow the seed and to trust in the deep, mysterious laws of growth hidden within the earth and in the timing of a providence that sent the rains in its own season, not according to their desperate schedules or their mounting fears. The farmer's entire life, Joseph murmured, was a long lesson in this delicate balance between diligent effort and patient surrender. He painted a picture for his son with the colors of the land itself. He described the different soils a seed might find, the hard-trodden path where it lay exposed and was snatched away by birds, the rocky ground where it sprouted with joy but had no depth and was scorched by the sun, the thorny patch where the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choked its fragile life. But then, his voice softening with a tender reverence, he described the good soil, the heart that received the word, that understood it, that held it fast through doubt and drought. That heart, he said, was not a place of perfect ease, but a field carefully tended, its rocks of stubbornness cleared, its thorns of worry uprooted, its hardness broken open by the plow of humility and hope. In such a heart, the seed would not just sprout, it would yield a harvest beyond all imagining, 30, 60, even 100 times what was sown. The growth was still a mystery, a miracle hidden in the dark, but the preparation of the soil was their sacred task. Samuel looked down at his own small, dirt-streaked hands, then at the neat, covered row where their seeds now slept. He thought of his father's empty nets, and the despair that had followed, and of the quiet trust that had slowly returned. He thought of the mustard seed his mother had shown him, so small and yet capable of such great, sheltering growth. The lesson was not just about barley and wheat. It was about everything. It was about the prayers they sent heavenward like seeds, trusting they would be answered in a time and a way they could not foresee. It was about the kind words sown in a neighbor's heart, the patient work of mending a net or a relationship, the slow, unseen growth of his own understanding. Faith, he began to see, was not a blinding flash of certainty, but a patient, daily tending. It was the courage to sow the seed even when the sky was clear, to trust the rain would come, and to wait through the long, silent stretch of germination with a heart full of hope, knowing that the most important work was happening not by their hands, but in the hidden, faithful dark, according to a timing as ancient and reliable as the turning of the seasons. Chapter 24, Evening Devotions. The day's last light bled from the sky, a slow, graceful surrender from brilliant gold to deep, tranquil indigo. In the soft, gathering dusk, the familiar contours of Nazareth softened, the harsh lines of mud brick homes and dusty paths blurring into a single, peaceful silhouette against the horizon. The frantic energy of the day, the mending, the weeding, the shared labor, had ebbed away, leaving behind a quiet that felt earned and holy. Inside their home, the family moved with a practiced, unhurried rhythm, drawn together by an invisible cord of shared purpose. This was the threshold of evening, the sacred space between the doing and the resting, a time dedicated not to the work of the hands, but to the tending of the spirit. Miriam lit the evening lamp, its small, steady flame pushing back the encroaching shadows, casting a warm, intimate glow over their faces as they gathered on woven mats near the doorway where the cool night air could gently touch them. The simple act of coming together was itself a prayer, a silent acknowledgment that the day's burdens and blessings were not meant to be carried alone. Joseph, his large frame settling into a posture of repose, let out a long, slow breath, the tensions of the fisherman and the farmer seeming to melt from his shoulders into the quiet earth beneath him. Leah and Samuel sat close, their youthful energy finally stilled, their eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight, attentive and soft. There were no prescribed words, no rigid liturgy to follow. Their devotion was a living, breathing thing, woven from the stuff of their own lives. Joseph began, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that seemed to harmonize with the chirping of the first crickets outside. He did not speak of abstract theology, but of the day's tangible graces. He gave thanks for the strength in his arms that had drawn the nets, even when they came up light, for the solid wood of the boat that had borne him safely on the unpredictable sea, for the community of other fishermen whose shared struggle was a comfort. His gratitude was for the tools of his trade and a resilience to use them, a recognition of the partnership between his labor and the divine provision that made it possible. Miriam's turn came, her voice a gentler, more melodic counterpoint. Her thanks were for the hearth, for the small defiant flame that had cooked their food and warmed their home. She spoke of a garden, of the feel of the damp, fertile soil between her fingers and the sight of the new green shoots pushing toward the sun. She gave thanks for the health in their bodies, for the simple, profound miracle of breath and heartbeat, for the absence of the fever that had so recently threatened their neighbor. Her devotions were rooted in the immediate, in the small, daily miracles of nourishment and care that sustained their physical lives, each one a brushstroke in the portrait of a loving providence. Then it was the children's turn. Leah, her voice soft but clear, spoke of the shared loaf of bread at the noon meal, of the taste of the olives from their own tree, of the laughter that had echoed in the square during the harvest feast. Her gratitude was for the bonds of family and community, for the feeling of belonging to something larger than herself. Samuel, his thoughts still colored by his father's lesson of the seeds, gave thanks for the hidden things, for the mystery of growth in the dark soil, for the promise of rain held in the empty sky, for the patient, unseen work of God that happened while they slept. His was a faith learning to trust in the invisible, to find comfort in the processes he could not control, but in which he was invited to participate. One by one, they laid their blessings upon the quiet air, health, food, community, each offering a small bright stone added to a cairn of collective gratitude. The recitation was not a listing of wants fulfilled, but a remembrance of gifts already given, a practice of focusing the heart on the abundance that was so easy to overlook in the struggle for survival. As the last word faded, a deep, comfortable silence descended, more eloquent than any prayer. They sat together in the warm pool of lamplight, their individual spirits quieted, merged into a single, peaceful presence. Yosef lifted his gaze then, through the open doorway to the world outside. The last vestiges of color had vanished, and the sky was now a deep, velvety black, dusted with the sharp, brilliant pinpricks of countless stars. They hung in the vastness, cold and distant, yet their sheer multitude spoke of an order and a grandeur that dwarfed his moments of doubt and fear. Under that infinite canopy, the worries about the next catch, the repairs to the roof, the disputes over land, all shrank to their proper size. The same silent, majestic power that governed the constellations also held their small mud-brick home in its care. The stars were not a sign of a distant, uncaring God, but a reminder of a faithfulness as vast and reliable as the cosmos itself, a covenant written in light. The family sat in that knowing silence for a long time, their evening devotions complete, their hearts full, their spirits resting in the quiet assurance that they were seen, known, and held, here under the patient, watching stars. Chapter 25. A new day's promise. The first hint of dawn was not a color, but a softening of the world's edges, a gentle erosion of the night's profound black into a deep, velvety gray. Then, as if a single, silent breath had been drawn, a sliver of palest gold appeared on the eastern horizon, a thin, brilliant line separating the dark earth from the fading dome of the sky. The light, tentative at first, began to bleed upward, washing the stars from the heavens one by one until only the morning star remained, a solitary, brilliant sentinel holding its watch. In the mud-brick home in Nazareth, the new light crept through the high window, finding the same dust motes to illuminate, the same familiar shapes to gently rouse. The cycle was complete, the wheel of day and night turning with a rhythm as ancient and reliable as the divine breath that sustained it. Joseph stirred, his body attuned to this daily resurrection. He rose, his movement slow and deliberate, and his first act was the same as 1,000 mornings before, a quiet glance around the room that held his sleeping family. But this morning the glance held a new quality, a settled peace that had been hard won. The memory of empty nets and star-chilled despair was a part of him now, but it was a scar, not an open wound. It had been healed by the salve of Miriam's unwavering faith and the profound shift in his own understanding. He saw not just what was, but what could be. His mind, no longer clouded by fear, turned to the future with a quiet, hopeful pragmatism. He thought of strengthening the goat pen before the next winter, of trying a new spot on the lake the other fishermen spoke of teaching Samuel to properly mend a net, not just as a chore, but as a passing on of legacy and hope. His plans were humble, rooted in the soil of his life, but they were made with a heart that now trusted the rain would come and the harvest would follow in its own good time. Miriam awoke as the golden light touched her face. She rose and went to the hearth, kneeling to breathe life into the embers with the same steady patience. As the small flame caught and grew, its light danced in her eyes, which held a deep, reflective calm. The journey to Jerusalem, the teacher's words, the homecoming, they had settled within her, becoming part of the bedrock of her spirit. She looked at her children still sleeping, and her heart swelled with a love that felt both fiercely protective and infinitely tender. She thought of the future, of the people they would become. She saw Leah's quiet compassion blossoming into a life of service, her hands becoming true instruments of healing and comfort. She saw Samuel's questioning mind deepening into a wisdom that could find God not only in the scriptures, but in the turn of the soil and the pull of a rope. Her hopes for them were not for wealth or status, but for resilient faith and kind hearts, for lives woven tightly into the enduring bonds of family and community, cherishing those bonds as their greatest earthly treasure. The children awoke to the smell of kindling wood and the growing light. They rose and began their tasks, fetching water and tending to the animals, but their movements were touched with the awareness that this day was both an ending and a beginning. The recent past, the storm, the pilgrimage, the lessons, felt like a single long chapter that was now closing, its lessons etched into their souls. The future stretched before them, not as a blank page, but as a field already sown with the seeds of all they had learned, seeds of trust from their father, seeds of resilience from their mother, seeds of compassion from their community, and the startling, luminous seed of a love that commanded them to forgive and to serve. They did not know what that future held, but they faced it without the old anxieties. Their young faith, a tender but sturdy shoot, ready to grow into whatever shape the sun and the rain of days to come would allow. As the family gathered for their simple morning meal, the sun finally cleared the horizon, flooding the room with a clear, brilliant light that felt like a blessing. They broke their bread and ate in a comfortable silence, a sense of profound gratitude hanging in the air between them. They had been tested by wind and wave, by doubt and fear, and they had endured. They had journeyed to the heart of their faith and returned not with easy answers, but with a deeper, more resilient trust. The day beginning outside their door was a gift, a clean slate, yet it was also part of the great, beautiful, and cyclical pattern of life, of sowing and reaping, of storm and calm, of doubt and grace. They rose from their meal with a quiet purpose, stepping out into the promise of the new day, their hearts anchored in the love that held them, their lives a continuing prayer, woven into the eternal faithful rhythm of the dawn.